Great. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Creative Mornings. The Victoria Arts Council respectfully acknowledges the Lekwungen-speaking people within whose traditional territory we operate, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wassanic First Nations, whose historical relationships with this land and diverse cultural heritage continue to this day. We raise our hands in gratitude for the ancestors, matriarchs, hereditary leaders, and the artists from these lands, and we give thanks for the privilege of living and working here. And now might be a good time to just reflect on where we all are individually. I know our guest speaker today is zooming in from Cowichan. So yeah, I'll just pass it over to Cass. Oh, but I should say my name is Kagan McFadden, and I'm the Executive Director of the Victoria Arts Council and the lead for Creative Mornings Victoria. And very happy to be co-hosting this talk today.
There's some slides. Okay, so welcome to Creative Mornings. Sorry. April's theme is movement. Movement is a universal state of being. Even at rest, the matter we're composed of is in motion. Subatomic particles whirl about at a dizzying speed to create the sense of solidity. The things that appear still, the earth beneath us, the trunk of a tree above us, is but a trick of the eye. They are moved slowly, but at a staggering scale. Our Wellington chapter chose this month's exploration of movement, and Hannah Webster illustrated the theme, and MailChimp is presenting the theme. Thank you to MailChimp, Creative Mornings' official partner for marketing. To the entrepreneurs and business owners, you may wonder how to keep your business growing. The answer to this can depend, as everyone's business has various complex factors that shape each one. Whether you've just launched your agency or a seasoned freelancer, the MailChimp & Co. company has created 5 tips to help grow your business, and you can visit Creative Morning website for more information. The number one way people learn about Creative Mornings is through their friends. So whether they've never heard of Creative Mornings or been away for a long time, get them to tag along next time so that we can hear more presentations. Thank you to the City of Victoria and the CRD for their continued support. And thank you to HCMA. HCMA is an architecture firm that designs buildings, brands, and shared experiences that connect people. So we are from the Victoria Arts Council, and we'd like to share our current exhibition, Avis Rasmussen View from Here. In this retrospective exhibition spanning 6 decades of production, we recognize the astounding output by local artist Avis Rasmussen. A focus on Avis's oscillating points of view from the intimate to international offer a much-needed look at this artist's work. Our Artist in Conversation and book launch is this Sunday at 3 p.m., and we'll also be hosting a curator's tour on May 28th at 3 p.m. Sorry, I keep doing that. So in addition to our main space, we have a number of community satellite galleries around Victoria, including the Victoria International Airport and 5 Greater Victoria Public Libraries. So please visit our website for more information on locations and what shows are on at the moment. So the aim of the PDIC project is to support physical and digital collaborations between artists and create opportunities for significant new directions, outcomes, and inquiries. This 16-month project kicked off in September 2022, engaging artists from a variety of disciplines, including Melissa Flagg, our speaker today, as well as Evan Locke, Amber Downey-Back, Lee Zed, Ebony Rose, Jane Chan, Valerie Sells, Mina Lee, and Riley Anderson of Art Action Earwig, Kayla Henry, Nicole Mandrake, and Owen Fairburn. These artists are given the opportunity to collaborate, create, and present works in varying stages of development. It includes several performance and exhibition opportunities, creative and artistic support from the project team, and leadership from 3 local art organizations, including ourselves, Exchanges Gallery and Studios, and MediaNet and Flex Media Gallery. The first PDIC public exhibition, Emergence Dissemination 1, was presented from February 24th to 26th at Exchanges Gallery, Archive Arts, Artist Run Center, and Errant Art Space, and showcased a multimedia installation, an AR installation, and a live multimedia performance. Funding for the PIDC project is provided by the Canada Arts Council, with additional funding for the project and acquisition provided by the IMAA and the Government of Canada. So I will pass it over now to Kagan to introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Cass. So Melissa Flagg is an independent filmmaker, writer, and movement artist working across multiple disciplines. In her film work, Melissa uses an intimate style of storytelling in approaching her subjects, often interweaving genres such as documentary, narrative, experimental film, and screen dance. In her 15 years of creating uniquely compelling film and video work for international audiences, Melissa has collaborated on dozens of projects with other artists, dancers, storytellers, theater professionals, and is passionate about engaging community through her work. As a movement artist and facilitator, Melissa enjoys working with diverse populations and abilities and is continually learning from the wisdom of the body and the earth. She brings over 20 years of practice in contemporary dance, yoga, martial arts, and other somatic modalities to her work, and is currently completing training as a somatic movement therapist and educator. Recent projects include working with the Psychoteen national government on the Reviving Traditional Dance project and developing ecosomatic curriculum for retreats with adults. Melissa holds a bachelor's degree in media arts from Emily Carr Institute of Art and lives in North Cowichan on the unceded traditional territories of the Malahat, Lake Cowichan, Kowatsan, Halat, Penalacoot, and Chemainus and Liaxan people in BC, Canada. So please join me in welcoming Melissa Flagg.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kagan. Thank you, Kagan and Cass and the Victoria Arts Council for having me today. And I am today in my living room on the traditional lands of the Cowichan tribes people here. And so I'm excited to kind of talk a little bit about movement as a creative process and an influence, especially with the work that I'm doing in the PIDC project right now, which, as Kagan said, is sort of a multi-phasic collaboration and opportunity to exhibit work and create with other artists. So I have a bit of a PowerPoint that I'm going to kind of walk through and some imagery. So I'll just bring that up. All right, so I think a lot about movement from the experience of being a human body moving. And when I think about movement, I think about vibration and how sound, color, and movement are all actually essentially vibration. And the vibration is a basic pattern of life that, as Cass said in her introduction, everything is actually moving, everything is vibrating, down to sort of particles, but also in our body, our own cells have this kind of movement and vibration and this sort of inner sea that's always in these different kinds of, I guess, fluctuations of kind of going in and going out, this sort of like wave-like movement. And I love this quote by Maya Angelou, the great writer: everything in the universe has rhythm and everything dances. And I think about that a lot in my practice. How is creativity and the creative process a dance in and of itself. I'm also very, very curious about our kind of early beginnings and embryology. And so movement from that experience of life is our primary language. It's actually one of the first senses we develop when we're in the womb. We develop before we even, or around the same time, I guess, as our sense of touch starts to develop. We have an understanding of when we're moving, of what movement is. And that's really early, like within, the first sort of 12 weeks, we can register movement. So it's fascinating to me, and it's always something that I'm coming back to, is this idea of what moves us, how are we moved, and how are we moving, whether that's just as a human in the world, or whether that's through a process that we're in with our art, process that we're in with other people, with relationships, with collaborations. So this is my my meditation of what it feels like to be in the cell and kind of moving. So I'm just going to invite you for a moment to either let your eyes rest on the screen or close your eyes and just feel your own body and just notice what's moving. And when I look at this is from Cowichan here where I live, I see just all these patterns in the water. And I feel this sense of containment at the same time. So this is a bay, the water's contained by the land, but there's so much going on, so much movement going on underneath the water. And on the surface, there's these subtle patterns, these vibrations. And you might notice that even in your own body, just through feeling your breath, how it moves you, feeling your pulse. There's all these other processes going on, digestion, different things happening in our body that are all movement. So I have been thinking a lot about what it means to be both a mover, as a dancer and a somatic movement educator and therapist, and then also in my practice, and particularly coming into the PIDC as a filmmaker and as a writer and as a mover, and how I'm kind of collaborating and moving through this process with other people. So I am thinking a lot and curious about how movement reflects our moods, how we think, what we believe, and how we relate to each other. And I have this quote by Martha Graham, which I think is really interesting. Movement never lies. It is a barometer telling the state of the soul's weather to all who can read it. And before we started this conversation, some of you were here, I was talking a little bit about doing work with horses and how all their communication is through their body and through their body language, and that it never lies if they are, awake and open and not shut down. So I think about that in my practice, and particularly as I use movement as a daily practice to stay connected to my own creativity and just my own kind of bodily rhythms, a way of sensing myself and feeling myself. And I think about, what kind of movement is just authentically arising, and it's different every day. And sometimes, because I do a certain movement practice every day, I'm kind of sensing into or tracking how things change or how they might feel different, how movement actually feels different from day to day in my body. And what's interesting and what's curious to me And I really draw on that as really a foundation for my creative process in beginning projects and in entering into collaborative space, of using my body and my own kind of awareness, sensing and feeling myself, to come into and start to create together this creative collaborative space. What's going to move us? How are we going to be moved by each other, by outside influences? And so I'm always asking questions and being curious about those kinds of feeling tone. And I say here in my slide, I draw a lot from my somatic training, which is through Laban-Bartenieff movement analysis, and also training focusing on body-mind centering, developed by Bonnie Bainbridge-Cohen. So these are things that I've been studying through dance therapy and somatic movement therapy. And they are ways for me to stay curious and to be also observant about what I'm creating, what I'm moving towards in my own practice. So I think about, like I said, I think about effort life, which is feeling tone, which is quality of movement. And even as a writer and as a filmmaker, I think about these things, about qualities of movement, of feeling, space, inner space and outer space. So our environment and how that shapes us, but also our inner environment, how that's always shaping us. And certainly I think a lot about timing, especially as a media artist, the element of timing, of rhythm, stillness, speeding up, slowing down, and then the idea of sequencing through. So how does movement sequence through the body? Where does it begin or end? Does it go in a fluid kind of sequence, or does it skip? Does it arc and kind of curve? And even in our own artistic practice, thinking about sequencing, for example, when I'm editing film, in some ways, it's a kind of linear process of putting one thing after another thing, taking a step, taking a step, taking a step. But then there's also this opportunity to go back and revisit steps and change things, pull things apart, put them back together. And so there's these layers of sequencing happening, even in the way that we tell stories. And then the other elements I think about, particularly with movement and dance, are weight and pressure. And I think these are also things that a lot of artists think about in painting, drawing, the weight and the amount of pressure that we put through our materials onto a canvas or onto a page, or even the way we're kind of exerting ourselves in our own practice. Do we like push really hard? Are we putting a lot of kind of push and pressure behind how we come to our own creative process? Or do we tend to kind of be a little bit more light with our pressure? Do we tend to have this quality of kind of floating through the process? So that's really interesting to me. And then I also think about dimensions of space, and I'm always, especially as a mover, thinking about breath, because I feel like breath is really this animating force of movement. And certainly it's something as a human mover that is always there to come back to sense into, and just notice this thing that's amazing that's happening without having to think about it, that we're breathing and we're being breathed in a way also by our environment, by being on this planet. So I've spoken a little bit about this, but some of the questions that I'm asking through the artistic process and in my practice is what is the rhythm of the piece? What is shaping it, how it's being shaped? What am I shaping and how am I being shaped, especially in a collaborative process working with other artists? So in the PIDC project, working with artists from different disciplines, it's really interesting to notice how someone working with a painter or working with a sound artist or a dancer choreographer is, you know, shaping and impacting my own process and also what I'm creating. And then I think about dimensions, so in actual space, which is something artists think about a lot, within the frame or within the story is often how I'm thinking about it, especially with film. So what are the dimensions even within the camera? What am I seeing? What am I not seeing? And within a story, what are the dimensions of that story? Where does that story sort of exist in time and space? Those kinds of things. And then again, how does it sequence into the next thing? So the next page or the next frame, what's the next iteration as we go through a process? And even within the body as a mover, you know, how are things sequencing through my body? And then the feeling quality again. So I spoke a little bit about that, light, heavy, being really direct in our focus or multi-focused, timing, and then the idea of flow. And these are words from Laban movement analysis that I draw on a lot. So I was going to tell a little bit of a story about my creative process through phase 1 of the PIDC project. And so in this project, I worked with Kayla Henry, Mina Lee, and Riley Anderson. And we created a project called Lichens. And so I kind of broke down some of this creative process into these ideas around movement and how movement is shaping and influencing and actually supporting that creative process. So I have as the first kind of initial step the idea of presence and just the ground of being. So as a beginning point. And then the next phase, I think about stillness within movement and movement within stillness. And also this idea of I am here and where is here? Where am I? What's around me? What's in me? What's happening in this moment that's going to inspire what happens next in the creative process. And then the next phase, which I think is ongoing throughout the creative process and throughout life, is this idea of expansion and contraction. And so that, again, I go to the body and I think about breathing, how with our breath, there's an exhale, and then there's an inhale, and this just continues on and repeats over and over again. And so this idea of, as artists, when we enter into a project or a process, it's a cycle of these kinds of expansions and expanding out and like finding all kinds of ideas and inspirations and gathering research. And then there's these kind of natural contractions where we might kind of focus in or narrow in, or we might even come to a point that feels like stillness, nothing's moving. But we're actually within this cycle of opening and sort of closing. And then the next phase is this idea of inner and outer influences. And so the movement between those influences and inspirations, and those might be other collaborators, it might be getting or receiving feedback or putting your work into the world, and you know what happens when you take your work out, when it meets, you know, a gallery space, when it meets other people, and these kinds of interactions and movement, the kind of dance there. And then I think about, as a sort of final phase, this idea of just expression and intention. And I come back again to my experience of movement and the idea of the sensory motor loop, which is, sensation comes in, stimulus comes in, and then there's a movement out of that. And then again, it's a new stimulus arises, we move, and that continues too. So these kinds of cycles. And then also just developing our project or our work, bringing out more qualities of movement, and then what are the stories we're telling. So for the lichens project, we started, in terms of presence, we started with entering this creative space, this collaborative space together, and really kind of just asking these questions of who am I? What do I bring? What am I interested in? And then who am I with? What are they bringing? What are they interested in? These could be ideas, these could be materials. And we sort of identified ourselves as movers. We called ourselves mover, shaker, scratcher, and fluid stretcher. And these were sort of characters that we brought into this collaborative space. We didn't know what we were going to create yet, but they started to influence how we might work together, and just gave us something to play with throughout the process. So then we just basically made a list of our interests, and from there started to really kind of bounce off of each other. So in that first phase, I began by going out into the forest on the lands here, the Cowichan lands, and photographing lichens primarily, because we started to hone in on this idea of an ecosystem and of the role of lichens in the ecosystem. And so I was really curious about, okay, well, where am I? What's the actual environment around me? And what am I curious about? And I went into the forest and I worked with my camera in a sense of a camera as a kind of mover through the forest. And so sometimes my camera was moving, and sometimes I was just noticing the movement of the forest and having this dialogue and being curious. So these are some of the photographs of the different lichens, which were starting to make their way into my contribution to our collaboration. And then the next phase I'm kind of tracking here is this idea of stillness within movement and movement within stillness. And so asking questions, what are the questions that lead to more movement? So what gets us kind of almost expanding out or moving forward through this process? And so we began to talk about, what would we look like? What would this piece look like? What were the different elements? The idea of projections, of audio, what were the digital components, the physical components? And then in my photography and my exploration in the environment and with lichens, I was thinking about, again, just what's around me, the camera as a witness, and then my body as this experience mover in this space. And then just finding these places of stillness and of movement within the camera. And that was sort of what guided me into the next part of the process. So this is, again, just some of my documentation from being in the forest with the lichens. And just getting curious about what drew me in. Was it the movement itself sometimes, which would be like the wind moving the trees? Or was it just the shapes and dimensions and color of these lichens? So then in the next phase of the process, the idea of expansion and contraction. And like I said, I think this is really always with us in terms of the creative process. But for us as a group, we began to jam around some of our concepts coming together, and we had some time for rehearsal, not a lot, but we did come together in physical space with ideas, with some found objects, and we started to play and kind of more develop these elements and create this idea of an ecosystem that we would present as an installation and a performance. So then I started to work more with video and the idea of this element of time, of rhythm, of expanded time and condensed time. And the choreographer and dancer Kayla Henry was working with some bones and the idea of a character of kind of like a deer in the forest. So that kind of, then we started to move more and more towards this idea of creating this ecosystem or this landscape to then explore movement within that. And my role at this point was as a collaborator, bringing in the elements of the video projection, and also starting to just create a score, a movement score, and a performance score. So at this point, I started to explore bringing the lichens into my studio and photographing them instead of out in the forest, but in their not natural environment. And it was in the fall, so it was after a big storm, and there was a lot of windfall. So I picked up some branches and some lichens that had fallen down onto the ground, and I brought them into my studio and just was curious about getting to know these living beings and what my camera would sort of find in a studio environment. So changing up the environment in terms of how that was shaping what was coming in for me and what I wanted to give to the group. So these are just a few images from the studio. And then the other thing we started to do was Kayla brought her character in, which had these bones, and we were exploring this character of a deer moving through the forest. And so that's some of this footage. And then the idea of moving and being moved. So this idea of inner and outer influence. So we went to this place of bringing in these kind of new characters and different ideas. The bones were an inspiration, as well as the lichens. And then we put something together. So we had a live rehearsal that audience was invited to, and we kind of got to test some of our ideas. And this is what was really interesting, because receiving feedback then really changed the scope of the project. So this idea of kind of, again, we went through this big expansion of, okay, we're going to draw in these elements and add this, and we kind of opened things up and just were experimenting with a lot of different things. And then the feedback that we got was really interesting, and we worked with that feedback in a way that actually ended up, we sort of came back to condensing and kind of focusing in and losing some of those other elements that we had added. So we came back to narrowing the focus, and really that feedback and that loop, I guess, of expanding and then contracting led us back to our original intention and to the concepts that we wanted to work with, and then to making choices and finding more clarity with what we actually wanted to create. So I just wrote down some of these things in terms of our rehearsal. We got more intentional about creating our movement performance score. And so a score is basically a way of notating certain things are going to happen at certain times. Everything was quite improvisational in terms of our movement and the sound, but certain things were structured and timed. And then again, asking those questions, how are we being moved now by the space we're creating? And how do we move in the space? What kind of movement is actually created by lichens? How do they, as organisms, move or vibrate in their environment? We also were curious about the sound of lichens, the sound of ecosystems, and the different relationships. And perhaps there wasn't an actual sound that we could hear as humans, but Riley worked with different microphones, and we were playing with contact microphones and actually creating sound through touching lichens or through touching sticks or rocks or different materials and our own bodies. And then in terms of sort of the final phase of expression and the intention behind that. So again, for me, bringing it back to this idea of movement, there's always these loops happening, this kind of receiving information, moving from that, receiving more information, moving from that. That's taking us through the process. And I work with that a lot in my own creative process, writing and filmmaking and moving. So together we were moving as a group. We started to, really find our own kind of rhythm together. In terms of the score we created, we got more interested in qualities and contrasts of both the movement, the sound, and the projection, and how these would all come together. We did more scoring and setting movement. So we had some, even though it was improvisation, we had some kind of choreographed moments or choreographed qualities of movement. And then creating the space, we kind of start to build the space so it felt a little bit more like an ecosystem to us, that we would be moving in or be interested in moving in. And then that responsiveness and feedback in terms of what was our own experience from our rehearsal, our live rehearsal, to be a mover in that space that we had set up, that installation space with projection and sound and these different sculptural elements in it. And so here is just an excerpt from the live performance. These are just a few little moments. And so also the whole sound score was created live by Riley, who's sitting there with his instruments and digital instruments. So we were working a lot with layers, and it's dark here to see, but a lot of layers, sculptural layers within the environment, the layers of projection. We had two different projectors. One was handheld, and then we had this sort of sound. So I'm just going to stop my share for a moment. There we go. And I was going to take us through a little movement exploration if people were interested, but I'm just not sure timing wise. Maybe we want to open it up to some questions. What do you think, Kagan?
We've got about 10 minutes, and we do try to end right at noon for everyone's schedules. So how long do you think the exercise is?
Let's see. I could aim to do it in just 2 minutes. We'll do just a short
Sure.
experience.
Yeah, let's do it.
So, I want to invite us to just play with that idea of expansion and contraction. So if you just take a moment wherever you are in your space to, you might want to, close your eyes or just soften your gaze and just notice your breath. So as your breath moves in and out, you might begin to notice that on the inhale, there's some expansion through your lungs, maybe through your ribs, maybe even into your pelvis. And when you exhale, you might notice movement as you narrow or condense and contract a little bit with the action of your diaphragm. And then for a moment, imagine that you are going to take an idea that you have for a project. Maybe it's something you're working on right now, or something that you're thinking about starting. And you're going to place it in between the palms of your hands. And you're just going to feel that idea or that project. Maybe see the size of it or feel the energy of it. Just become aware of whatever elements that you're working with right now in regards to that project. And then on your next inhale, you're going to start to open your hands, open your body, just find some expansion, whatever feels just natural or authentic to you. And imagine that project suddenly expanding beyond what it is right now. So maybe you're inviting collaborators, or maybe it's turning into a series, or maybe you're going to use a bigger canvas or go beyond your usual color palette. Whatever it is, just start to open it up in your space, inviting new ideas, new explorations. And just until you feel kind of a still point, like, okay, this feels expanded enough right now. And when you feel that still point, I'm going to invite you to just notice what you notice, whatever your attention lands on, and then start to just shrink back in towards that one point of focus. And as you do that, you can bring your hands back towards each other, just staying curious about that point of focus. And again, moving until you find that still point. Like, okay, this is small enough. Coming back to one point of focus. And then just notice where you want to go. Do you want to open up again and invite something else into that framework? Maybe through your breath or through the movement of your body. Are there other ideas that naturally are starting to come in? And then just take a moment, 1 minute here, to just follow your own rhythm of expanding and contracting And then wherever your attention is right now, you might want to just make a note of it. Maybe it's something you want to come back to and explore later, or something you're just curious about, or you might just let that go altogether. And then when you're ready, if you want to come back to Zoom, and if you have any questions for me, I'd love to hear from you. I know we only have a few minutes.
That was really nice, though, Melissa. It's so rare that we get to do these sort of exercises in Creative Mornings. So it's a nice, fruitful way of thinking creatively. The floor is open if anyone has any questions. If you'd rather put them in the chat, that's also an option just at the bottom there. But please feel free to ask Melissa about her project and her research. Well, it looks like there is a chat question. Simona says, how fascinating, Melissa. And seeing the infinity symbol in your slides, I felt how well it applies to movement, loops. It was inspiring, and thank you. Thank you, Simona. It's been such a packed collaborative project, the PIDC, and so thank you for just scratching the surface of that. I was in the audience at Exchanges this winter when that performance was presented, and it was fantastic. And I was actually really moved by the shaking and the scratching, which sounds more like medical when I say it that way, but it wasn't. It was so beautiful and so poetic and such a collaboration with the environment. So I was really excited to see that and to hear you speak about it today. And yeah.
Thanks, Keegan.
Andrea has a question. Andrea's wondering, I have worked as a movement professional for the last 15 years across the domains of physical rehab, strength and conditioning, and most recently motor control systems of movement and the affect of chronic pain on the movement system. I'm interested to know about what you've considered about chronic pain from your somatic background and the expressions of pain in movement. Great question. Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a big question. I know some of the ways that I have worked with chronic pain is just through, I guess, the idea of titration in the body. So the idea of, first of all, finding, and then you probably know this as a movement professional, just finding like resources in the body. But even the idea of titrating between like that intensity of chronic pain or of pain, and then having other places to go in the body or other movements that are like a recuperation from that. And I think that is a process to find that, particularly with clients and within our own bodies. But it's, for me, I think it always comes back to just developing that, or strengthening the awareness of our own kind of body system, what we experience, what we feel, and learning to experience the sensation without necessarily the ideas we have about those sensations. So that's one I guess avenue for exploring it. But in the somatic work that I'm doing now, it's a lot about resourcing, and a lot about finding whatever those body systems are too, that may not be so impacted, I guess, by the chronic pain, that are kind of an area, something to move into, that can support and resources the other systems. Some ideas I have, and I would be certainly curious to hear more from your perspective. Yeah, perhaps you could reach out to me. I can share my contact in the chat if anyone wants to reach out with their questions. Okay, so here's my email. Yeah, and feel free to reach out. I'd love to continue that conversation. I'd be really curious to know your experience and how you're working with people.
Since the PIDC project is so expansive, I do believe there's a presentation just next month. Is that right? Are you part of that?
Yeah, so our presentation is actually has been pushed back to July.
Oh, okay.
For the group, we're kind of we're all needing more time. We sort of jumped in out of the phase one into phase two, and yeah, and so everyone kind of hit this place where they were like, okay, things are just starting to get really interesting and juicy, and we want a little bit more time before we present. So I know my group right now that I'm working with, we're planning to present at Flux Media Gallery in July now.
Okay, fantastic.
And I believe the other groups will be later presentations too. Yeah.
Okay, great. And just since it is the Victoria Arts Council hosting this session, I wanted to just let everyone know that we'll be proudly presenting Melissa along with the whole, I hope, the whole cohort of PIDC in November at our main gallery on Store Street. And so that will be the culmination of this 18-month-long project. So you can come and see the exhibition in person. As well, we're dedicating an issue of our digital magazine, Until, to the PIDC project. So everyone will have a lot of writing and images, and we can embed movement and video. So that is something else to look forward to if you are a fan of Melissa's and want to support what's going on through the PIDC. So that'll be this fall, specifically November, at the Victoria Arts Council. But I think we're just about out of time. I'm sure there's maybe time for one more question if it's a burning one, and then we'll let everyone go for the day.
Thank you very much. It was great, Melissa.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Melissa. And we look forward to seeing you all again. The next iteration of Creative Mornings is going to be the last Friday of May, and that is with Isaiah Bell and Sean Geist. And Sean and Isaiah are the co-producers of a one-man queer opera that is being performed this coming month, Pacific Opera, called The Book of My Shames. So we're looking forward to hearing Sean and Isaiah talk on the topic of acceptance. So that should be pretty exciting. Anyway, if you're looking for this video, it'll be uploaded sometime this weekend or early next week, and free to circulate among your peers. So thanks so much, Melissa, and for everyone that joined.
Thank you. Thanks, Kagan
Thank you.
and
Bye-bye.
Cass.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good one.